This is the beginning of part 2 of our module on Basel I and Basel II quantitative rules, which reviews the framework for bank capital regulation under Basel I and Basel II, analyzes in detail the quantitative rules contained in these standards, illustrates some of the principal weaknesses and inconsistencies in these standards, and summarizes some of the likely changes currently under consideration by the Basel authorities. We remind you that this part 2 contains 3 chapters. Chapter 3, which summarizes the rules and calculations underpinning Basel II, its key differences with Basel I, and its main remaining weaknesses and limitations. Chapter 4, which summarizes the changes currently under consideration by the Basel authorities, sometimes loosely referred to as Basel III, and Chapter 5, which contains the quiz. This Chapter 3 summarizes the rules and calculations underpinning Basel II, highlights the key differences with Basel I and why these differences were considered necessary, and discusses the remaining weaknesses and limitations of the new standard. We remind you first that we focus principally in this chapter on the Basel II standardized approach and discuss only briefly the internal ratings-based alternatives towards the end. The full set of rules for Basel II, including various interpretations and supplementary documents, span several hundred pages and cannot possibly be analyzed in depth in this module. National regulators in major jurisdictions have also issued so-called implementation guidelines, which add several hundred more pages to these rules, addressing in particular the qualitative criteria and procedures banks must satisfy to become eligible for regulation under the internal ratings-based approaches. Much of this material will be discussed in more specialized modules in the future, but we can convey the essence of Basel II, and in particular of the standardized approach, in a reasonable amount of time in the next few slides. The standardized approach begins by splitting exposures among sovereign, bank, corporate, retail, and securitizations. The table appearing now lists the risk weights for sovereign exposures. We can interpret credit assessment in the table for our purposes to mean an external credit rating from S&P, Moody's, or Fitch, although other credit agencies are considered acceptable depending on their credibility and methodology. The key change you should have noted is the disappearance of the OECD moniker in any determination of risk weights and its replacement with the sovereign's credit rating, and also the introduction of a 150% risk weight for sovereigns rated below single B-. Although this is undoubtedly an improvement over Basel I, it still does not differentiate sufficiently among sovereigns on account of their vastly different credit quality. A sovereign rated single B- requires only 5 times as much capital as one rated single A+, while the 5-year default rate for the former historically has been about 20 or 30 times higher than for the latter. Also, an unrated sovereign has a better, i.e. lower, risk weight than one rated below single B-. Nonetheless, the figures in the matrix are an improvement over the two-sizes-fit-all approach from Basel I, and the internal ratings-based approaches go on to provide even further credit-based differentiation. The next tables list the risk weights for exposures to banks. Under either of two alternatives, the national regulator may choose between within his country. Here's the first table, and here's the second table. Under option 1, a bank is quite simply given a risk weight exactly one category higher than that of its sovereign. The logic for this being the explicit or implicit government support that banks expect from the sovereign in times of difficulty. Option 2 relates the bank's risk weight directly to that of its own external credit rating and continues the Basel I idea of granting preferential treatment to short-term claims against banks, although it now defines short-term as 90 days or less versus, you may recall, 1 year under Basel I. For corporates, the risk weights are those appearing in the next table. Again, revealing greater differentiation than under Basel I, but still far less than is economically appropriate, and again permitting an unrated corporate to benefit from a lower risk weight than one that is poorly rated. Securitized investments are risk weighted according to the following tables. Note the specific inclusion of short-term ratings here, attributable to the fact that much securitized paper is issued by asset-backed commercial paper conduits and has only a short-term credit rating, or represents the shortest maturity tranche of automobile or other consumer securitizations designed to appeal to money market funds. Note also, more importantly, the 350% risk weight that applies to tranches rated BB, whether with a plus or minus, or with no qualifier, reflecting the regulatory view that these tranches contain the bulk of credit risk from the original portfolio in a compressed form, so cannot be treated the same way as comparably rated bonds issued by sovereigns, banks, or corporates. The 350% risk weight, when multiplied by the 8% minimum capital requirement, leads to a capital charge against these instruments equal to 27% of their value. By the same token, tranches rated even lower than double B minus, or not rated at all, are said to be deducted from capital in the right column here. Which means that the capital allocated to them must be 100% of their value. This is the regulator's way of saying that investments like these are so risky and so likely to default and recover zero that the safe thing to do is, in effect, to write them off completely as soon as they are purchased. Any pleasant surprise in performance after the purchase date will work its way via the income statement back into retained earnings and hence into Tier 1 and aggregate capital. You will sometimes hear people attribute to this category a risk weight of 1,250%, a number which, when multiplied by 8%, leads to the 100% capital charge specified. This all becomes tedious quite quickly, as you have undoubtedly concluded, so we wrap up this discussion by mentioning that retail mortgages, provided they meet a number of criteria, now attract only a 35% risk weight versus 50% under Basel I, and that other retail exposures, such as those from credit cards and installment loans, attract now a 75% risk weight versus 100% under Basel I. One other very important change introduced under the standardized approach is the elimination of the zero credit conversion factor for short-term, undrawn lines of credit, which now attract, in the majority of instances under the standardized approach, a 20% CCF. Credit conversion factors from Basel I have otherwise remained the same, including those for derivatives, which continue to be based on the sum of the current exposure plus the estimate of potential future exposure specified in the matrix that we saw under Basel I. More interestingly, Basel II expands significantly the categories of collateral, particularly financial collateral, that can reduce the risk weight of an exposure. Listed next are some of the categories that are recognized to some degree or other under the standardized approach. Cash and gold. Rated debt securities. In the case of sovereign, double B minus or higher. In the case of others, triple B minus or higher. Recall that only debt securities of sovereigns or quasi-sovereigns were eligible under Basel I. Senior unrated debt securities issued by a bank, if listed on a recognized exchange, and all other bank issues are rated triple B minus or higher, a category that was essentially ignored under Basel I. Equities included in a main index or listed on a recognized exchange. This was absent completely under Basel I. Finally, UCITS/mutual funds, where the price is quoted daily and where the UCIT or fund invests only in the above instruments. given the substantial price volatility of some of these instruments. However, haircuts are applied under the rules to convert the current value of the collateral into a smaller number that is considered safe in price risk terms, and which then becomes the basis for the calculation of the capital charge reduction. Criticism of the standardized approach has centered mostly around 1. As we saw, a continuing failure to differentiate sufficiently between exposures of vastly different credit quality. And conversely, substantial differences in outcome for exposures that carry the same credit rating, with secured exposures rated BB+, attracting a risk weight of 350% versus only 100% for sovereigns of the same rating. Some of these criticisms become less relevant as banks migrate from the low-tech, standardized approach to one that is based on the bank's internal ratings. So we conclude this chapter by reviewing those approaches next. As their name indicates, the internal ratings-based approaches place greater reliance on banks' own internal credit rating systems to derive an appropriate capital charge for credit exposures. The main difference between the so-called foundation and advanced approaches is that the foundation approach requires banks to estimate an exposure's probability of default only, and then imposes on the bank regulatory estimates for loss given default and, in the case of commitments and contingencies, expected exposure at default. While under the advanced IRB approach, all three of these variables become the responsibility of the bank. Not surprisingly, banks aspiring for eligibility under the advanced IRB must meet even higher standards than those eligible for the foundation IRB. In exchange, risk-weighted assets for advanced IRB banks are generally expected to turn out lower than for foundation IRB banks, and risk-weighted assets for foundation IRB banks are expected to turn out lower than for banks adopting the standardized approach. This is designed to give banks an incentive to invest in their risk management systems, controls, staff, data, and quantitative capabilities, and to reflect that those banks that have made the necessary investment rightfully need a lower cushion of capital for unexpected losses than those who have not. Whether any of this is justified, given the recent experience from the 2008-2009 financial crisis, which revealed many of the most sophisticated banks to be singularly inept in many key aspects of risk management, is a matter we leave for you to consider. We spend just a moment illustrating the extraordinary complexity of some of the formulas under the IRB approaches. Appearing shortly in front of you is the formula that converts the internally derived default probability of a corporate, sovereign, or bank exposure into its capital charge via two other formulas that also recognize the exposure's maturity, its likely correlation to other exposures, but based solely on its default probability, and its loss given default. Here is the main formula, and here are the related two formulas. In the main formula, n refers to the normal standard distribution and g to its inverse. You will quickly understand why we think it pointless to spend much time exploring in detail the logic behind these formulas, at least in the present module, which purports to offer only an introduction to this vast topic. We therefore bring to a close this chapter 3, and with it also the whole of this part 1 of our module on Basel 1 and Basel 2.